on behalf of the Certification Commission for Healthcare Interpreters, we're pleased to welcome you to this webinar, Anatomy of Performance-Based Training. This webinar is for trainers, and the objective is to help us all understand how to put together both live and asynchronous performance-based trainings and how to get them accredited through CCHI's CEAP program. The webinar will be presented by CCHI Commissioners. We have Johanna Parker, Paco Martinez, I'm Vonessa Costa, and we'll be joined by our Executive Director, Natalya Mytareva. We are interpreters, we are trainers, and we recognize that there's a shortage of performance-based training opportunities for certified interpreters, and we need your help in changing that. So the webinar will talk about guidelines for performance-based training development, the importance of feedback, and then we'll take you through the anatomy of a live performance-based webinar and conclude with some tips on getting your training accredited as performance-based with CCHI. So what is performance-based training? CCHI defines performance-based training as training that aims to improve a healthcare interpreter's skills in the 3 interpretation modes: consecutive, simultaneous, and sight translation, and also in written translation. However, a maximum of 8 hours in performance-based written translation training is allowed in each renewal cycle. Performance-based courses involve practice, instructor-led practice, either in person or online. And of course, practice is different than discussion. When we talk about practice or performance, we're talking about doing the thing and not just talking about it. And that's why group discussion does not qualify as performance-based training. The performance-based courses need to have practice, instructor-led feedback or peer feedback, or a model of the performance-based skills that are being taught or developed in the training. An example of this is that a vocabulary drill would not be considered a performance-based activity. It's an activity that builds knowledge, and of course, knowledge is essential to our work. But it is not performance-based, whereas paraphrasing as a skills development training exercise would be considered a performance-based activity. So when you think PB or performance-based, think doing the work, practicing the skill, and not just discussing the skill. So performance-based training has been a part of interpreter training for a very long time. And as far back as 2011, the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare set out national standards for healthcare interpreter training programs. It's a wonderful document that outlines program content, instructional methods, and programmatic standards. There are some key points in this document that help us understand the importance and value of performance-based training. The document recognizes that interpreting is a skill-based profession. It recognizes that a basic program of study will have plenty of opportunities to develop the foundational skills of healthcare interpreting. And it recommends that instructors dedicate a significant amount of time to guided practice, and that interpreting students receive feedback, and that their skill development be monitored throughout the course. So it is very much in line with the CCHI focus on performance-based testing and performance-based training. So what are the design parameters of performance-based training? There are 8 things that an instructor will want to consider when planning their training curriculum. These 8 things are the learning objectives, the difficulty, the language of instruction, the duration, the delivery method, the size of the group, the content structure, and of course, the setting up feedback and debriefing. We're going to touch on each of these 8 points briefly. When we think about learning objectives, it's really important that they be measurable and achievable. What that means is to set reasonable goals for the amount of time that you have set aside for your course. For example, it's not possible to teach simultaneous interpreting in an hour, but it is possible to introduce exercises that will help students hone their practice in the course of an hour, or to do a 1-hour focused practice on simultaneous interpreting in a specific setting, for example, genetics. So it's important to think about how much time do I have and what is measurable and achievable within that time, and to be realistic about the learning objectives. It's important also to consider the skill level of the target audience. Is this a beginner level program? Is it intermediate? Is it meant for an advanced audience? And it's important to keep in mind that advanced levels of instruction may require more than 60 minutes, and it might be necessary to set aside a longer duration for the course. It is possible to deliver performance-based training in language-specific groups and also in language-neutral groups. An example of a language-specific group, the instructor might be teaching directly in the language of the group and the working languages of that group, or with language supportive elements such as bilingual texts or glossaries or language coaches. A language-neutral instruction model might involve a group of students that are working in a language that's unfamiliar to the instructor, or it might involve a diverse group of students representing multiple languages that are doing performance-based practice activities in English. It's important to think about the duration. You can do performance-based training in short nuggets of 1 to 2 hours, or you might have a course that takes a half day, a day, or multiple days. And of course, you would want to adjust your learning objectives accordingly. The delivery method can be live, with or without breakout rooms, or it can be asynchronous, self-paced, with or without peer or instructor-reviewed assignments. And of course, it is possible, and there are many great examples of live webinars or live group trainings that have then been adapted to asynchronous or self-paced online learning modules for the benefit of a broader audience. It's possible to do performance-based training with an audience of one, and of course, every self-paced online learning module is an audience of one. It's also possible to do it in small groups and in large groups. And there have been successful performance-based training events that included more than 500 attendees. Of course, with a very large group, the attendees must take responsibility for their own learning. It's important for the instructor to think out how they're going to set up the practice components and what will constitute student or participant involvement. And one example might be to include the use of open-ended responses as a form of debriefing, and to utilize platform features such as chat in engaging the broader audience in those open-ended responses. Now, when you're thinking about the content structure, it's important to recognize that 2 hours of training does not necessarily mean 2 hours of practice. It is okay to dedicate up to 50% of the time to presenting the content, teaching the skill that will be practiced. And of course, a fourth to a third of the time should be the active practice. Here we see an example of what a sample 60-minute performance-based structure might consist of. And you see here that there is, for example, 20 minutes dedicated to the content, to teaching the concepts, or perhaps the specialized vocabulary that will be practiced. About 5 minutes setting up the practice activity and outlining the parameters to the group. A solid 20 minutes of practice, followed by perhaps 10 minutes of debriefing in feedback, instructor feedback or peer-to-peer feedback. And the session might conclude with 5 minutes of Q&A. This is just one sample. There are many ways to structure your performance-based module. The entire workshop would count as performance-based, not just the 20 minutes or whatever time was spent actively doing the skill, because it is important to allow time for debriefing and for feedback. This is how we learn, and this is how we identify where we need to improve. And whereas individual interpreters, we require more performance-based practice. The next section is really about how to structure feedback and what are the different feedback models that could be utilized in performance-based training. And we'll pass it over to Paco to talk to us more about structuring feedback.
Thank you, Vanessa. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of feedback. It all starts at curriculum design point. So when you begin planning your workshop, start designing its practice activities too. From the beginning of your course design, it is important to think about the feedback you will use to make sure the learners are practicing and improving the skill offered in your description. During the course, before practice, always provide clear and simple instructions to describe the goals of each activity and what the expected results of the activity must look like. Whenever possible, model the desired result. You must provide assessment tools for your learners' feedback. Learners expect you to have this activity with you, or at least facilitate such interactions with their peers. Remember that if you plan this well, your feedback activities will be more effective and less time-consuming for you at the end of the workshop. Your training doesn't have to include all of these kind of types of feedback, but there must be at least one type of feedback or reflection. The three types of feedback in virtual trainings could be self-reflection, peer feedback, and instructor feedback. It is important to think about the feedback you will use to make sure the students are really getting the skill you have them practice. Some of the types of feedback in virtual trainings are in these examples. The first is self-reflection or self-monitoring. You can ask your students to do a self-reflection of their performance after a practice activity. Just make sure you first model it or provide a rubric with clear instructions on how to perform it. These are basic examples of self-reflection activities we recommend. Simple quiz. You can ask your learners to count omissions, or you can ask simple questions like, did you have any grammar challenges? Or you can create a free response self-reflection. In live webinars, you can use the chats of your platform or unmute some learners to provide a free response. In asynchronous courses, you can ask for an open-ended answer with a model response specific to the activity provided. So with the asynchronous models, always remember to model the exercise first. Model the self-reflection that you expect every learner to do, and then assign the self-reflection. You can also provide instructor or peer feedback in asynchronous setups, but it's much more complex to do and more time consuming for you, the instructor. When you ask your learners to do peer assessment or peer feedback, in a live webinar, you can use the breakout rooms and provide structured feedback. You may not do this in very large groups, like over 100 people, but you could do a demo or model the activity and invite people to critique. In the asynchronous models or courses, you can send recordings to peers for scoring, or you can ask them to give feedback. Or you can also create discussion forums, but remember to always provide the forum rules, give them an opportunity for reporting inappropriate comments, and remember that ideally and initially the instructor should moderate these forums. Two recommended assessment tools that support a structured feedback are the feedback checklist and feedback rubrics. The support checklists are lists of skills or items that learners need to observe when working in break rooms with peers or any other type of peer practice activity in your course. We'll see an example of this type of list on the following slide. Lab 7 is a simulation lab that uses the present checklist so learners participating in the simulation can provide peer feedback or self-feedback. In this rubric, they provide 3 checklists that concentrate in accuracy, quality of the language, and how they interpret managed challenges. Each of these checklists provides questions that peers need to answer to provide that feedback. You can create checklists that meet the goals of the practice activities in your own courses. The second feedback instrument is the self-assessment or peer assessment rubric, with clearly defined criteria that can be used by both single learners or peers when working together in assessment. I have used this rubric modifying what I ask the learners to do in any given activity before. And I can ask learners to do short peer assessment, concentrating in just one item, such as counting omissions or additions or mistakes. Then, as the course advances, I can ask them to assess each other using a combination of items. I will never use the whole rubric at once to avoid frustration by overwhelming the learners with too much work at once. For longer courses, it is worthwhile to vary the types of feedback. The last type of feedback in virtual trainings can be from instructors. Many learners will expect feedback from the instructor. That's only natural, and you can use the same tools in a variety of feedback activities. However, remember that this is a major investment of time. So make sure that you will have time to meet with all the learners individually if you promoted such service. Instructor feedback is time-consuming. If you are going to offer your own feedback, think of ways to do it for the whole group rather than individually. Role-playing or simulations with the whole group offering immediate feedback can help you ease the burden of individual feedback. Think of and create short individual feedbacks that can model what you expect them to notice and report when they do their own reflections and self or peer assessments. So you can keep your own feedback to a manageable level. For longer courses, it is worthwhile to vary the types of feedback. And with that, Johanna will provide us with a model of how to set up a practice-based training.
Thank you, Paco. So what I'm going to do is show you pieces of a performance-based webinar that I taught for CCHI several years ago. And to help make things clear, the slides of the webinar within the webinar that I'll be using, just FYI, are green like this. This was a live webinar. It was a large audience of several hundred people. It was a Spanish-specific webinar, although today I'll talk about how to do some of the exercises that I show in a language-neutral format. Because this was a large webinar, there was no peer feedback or direct instructor feedback, but it was still successful. So I start with an open-ended question, and this has 2 purposes. One, it helps me as the instructor know what challenges my audience faces in terms of the topic area. And it also helps make it clear to my participants that they can't hide behind their computer screens and do something else while the webinar is happening. They have to participate. So we're setting the stage with the skill that we're going to be practicing. What do you find most challenging about sight translation? People put in their answers. I might briefly respond, or maybe I'll just read a few of them out in case anyone isn't able to see the chat, but I move on from that pretty quickly to my own definition of the skill that will be practiced. We also look at the setting in which the skill is used, and here, as an instructor, I used a poll to elicit participation, which of course only works in a live webinar. And then highlighted some of the specific reasons in which it might be, you might feel comfortable or uncomfortable with the skill. Then we start to set up the sub-skills that the group will actually be working on today. And maybe I'll elicit participation in the chat for this, or maybe I'll just present it myself. But then I'll want to go through these specific sub-skills and explain them, because that's what we're going to be practicing. So here I talk about noun clusters and how they have to be unpacked, and how in English, noun clusters, which is a combination of nouns modifying nouns, doesn't work in Spanish. And in fact, if this were an English neutral workshop, I'd talk about how it doesn't work in other languages. And I might invite people to say whether they can build noun clusters in their own language. And I give some examples of them, like flu vaccine, like Center for Disease Control and Prevention, anti-smoking television ad campaign, or non-fat, low carbohydrate, nutrient dense, and fiber-rich leafy greens. Here I talk about the next skill, the next sub-skill of site translation, including chunking and parsing and quickly restructuring syntax. And I'm not going to go into those details right now. This webinar is on the CCHI website if you're actually interested in watching the recording. And again, I give more examples. And I start to look at examples actually in context, like in this paragraph, and we point out some of the different challenges. Okay, so that's the setting up of the skill. We set up the skill to be practiced and talked about the terminology. Next, we're going to talk about the terminology and content. So we're practicing this skill with now what content. And in this case, we're using the site translation of MRI checklists. So it's a good idea always to make sure that everyone is on the same page, everyone knows what we're talking about, and we start with just a quick review of the document, of what this document tends to contain. So here I'm explaining why we'll be practicing site translation of this type of document. Then I go into a very short lecture portion about what MRI is, because we can't site translate something that we don't understand, that we're not familiar with. So in this case, I chose to present this information in Spanish just to sort of help prepare people for site translating from English into Spanish, but it could easily be done in English for a language neutral version. And by the way, this is also where you could invite a medical professional to collaborate with you and deliver the content, or you could use videos, but you want to make sure that you are adjusting the content for interpreters. It's easy to go down a rabbit hole of more and more detailed information. And so you might need to zoom out as you're preparing. And remember, this is a short section of my performance-based workshop. I'm going to focus on what interpreters most need to know. So here we're explaining what an MRI is, we're showing an image of it. And again, depending on the level of your audience, you may go into more or less detail. If you know you're working with a group of very experienced interpreters, you may not need to show a picture of an MRI machine, for example. And then we start to talk about the specific challenges of the form that they'll be working with. So here we're talking about how the form looks for things that could make it not possible for the patient to have an MRI, like metal in the body, etc. And then we're done talking about what MRI is and what the MRI checklist is. We start talking specifically about the challenges of interpreting or site translating this form. So now we're going to actually get to the performance-based work and do some examples, go over some examples of activities. And the way you do your activities, again, will vary if you have a large group or a small group, or if you have language neutral or one monolingual, or not monolingual, if you have one language audience. If, let's say, I were to have a small group and it was multilingual, and I knew the different languages that people spoke, perhaps I would put them in breakout groups where they could practice themselves. or I might just have us all sit and discuss things together and practice together. But in a large group like this, what I actually did was have people work independently and then talk about it in the chat. So here's one exercise that we did. It was text analysis and site translation. So the setup was that the participants were to identify syntactical challenges for site translation of a series of sentences, and then actually do the site translation. And I made it very clear, do this out loud. Don't just read it and think about it, actually do it. So here was the first one. And because it was the first one, I had them do it, but then I gave an example. And when I gave my example of a site translation, I did it intentionally poorly. And so that way I can engage again my audience and ask them to put in the chat, for example, what needed to be corrected, or I could even use a poll. I could ask, how would you grade this site translation? Or I could say, what did you think about this, etc. Then I went over it and highlighted things that I wanted to highlight and talk through things, what to do with the and or, etc. in this case. And then we went on to the next one. And here is a translation of this sentence into Spanish that I used as an example of what a good, in this case, translation would be. And then I said it out loud as if it were a site translation. So here's an example of a language neutral exercise that can be done. So we had a sentence, this one, you may be advised or required to wear earplugs or other hearing protection during the MR procedure. And I encouraged people, or I would encourage people to think about what the challenges would be. And then I highlighted these challenges and asked them how they would solve them in their language. And in this case, you could have them put things in the chat, or you could break them into small groups if it were a smaller group. Finally, at the end of the workshop, we had a poll, and in the poll, it was essentially a quiz that asked about both the content that was covered as well as the exercises that were done. And this had two purposes. One, it allowed me to make sure that they participated, and the other, and that they were there for the actually physically in front of their computer for the entire thing. But also, it was a way for me to get to learn whether they learned what I wanted them to learn and potentially adjust my content for next time. One important thing in Zoom, if you're doing your webinar in Zoom, don't check allow anonymous in your settings, because this way you can download reports and see who actually did the quiz, and the report will also capture how long people were logged into Zoom in the session. And then finally, I always like to end any webinar, but especially a performance-based webinar, with resources for practice. So in this case, I found some examples, some links in Spanish and in English about MRI that they could use for practice. And then finally, at the end, we give them a webinar attendance code that they have to use in order for, and they have to send to me. This says CCHI, but I was giving it for CCHI. They have to, if for some reason I don't issue them a certificate because I didn't see them or something happened, they can email me with the code to prove that they were there. And of course, if somebody emails me with a code and I have no evidence that they ever logged in, I may not give them the credit anyway, because presumably Zoom is more reliable than them, and it's possible that somebody gave the attendance code to someone else. And with that, I will pass things to Natalya to discuss how to get your training accredited as performance-based.
Now that you've had the very thorough overview of what a performance-based webinar or online self-paced module could be, let me share a couple of tips about the logistics of accrediting your training on which you have worked so hard. The first thing, you want to make sure that you have a description ready, and that's kind of an abstract of what your program is like. And in that description, you really need to spell out that it includes practicing interpreting skills or sub-skills, and you need to name those skills. That's kind of the number one criterion that reviewers of applications will be looking for. And you have a list of those sub-skills on the screen right now, and both Vonessa, Johanna, and Paco, all three of them talked about different skills already. The other important thing is, again, I want to remind you what Vonessa mentioned in the beginning, that there are some activities, even though they include engagement with the audience, are truly not a performance-based training in the criteria that CCHI set. And that's, let's say, vocabulary building exercises like glossary creation, very important activity, and it's very interactive usually, but it will not qualify as performance-based under the definition of CCHI. Discussion of ethical issues in small groups. Again, even though it seems that individuals will be practicing, and even if they're practicing things like intervention or, requesting repetitions, all these skills are important for our job, but they're not meeting the definition of performance-based training that CCHI is looking for when we're accredited as PB. Role plays also won't qualify. And performing interpreting or translation without any feedback provided, because as you've heard Paco speak, there are very important goals that feedback achieves, and interpreting in general is a very intimate profession. Training is probably the only opportunity when many interpreters have to be assessed and get that feedback. So if your training does not include any feedback in any format, then it will not qualify as performance-based. Now, the second tip is that along with your description, you need to upload the lesson plan. And there are important elements that reviewers will be looking for there. First, you need to specify time slots dedicated to learners' practice, that we truly can see that this is the training that has a significant amount dedicated to actually doing, interpreting, or practicing a skill that you are teaching. Again, we don't mean that only that time would be accredited. Your whole training will be accredited, but the reviewers need to see how much time is allotted to practice. You also will need to explain how learners will receive feedback about their performance, in what format. And explain if you have requirements for completing a course beyond just attending it. These requirements could be a certain grade on a final quiz, or completion of X number of activities. If it's a self-paced virtual module, let's say you have the 10 exercises, you would require that learners will do all these 10 exercises or 10 activities before they receive the certificate of completion. So all these details are very important to mention in that lesson plan. And then the last parameter is actually technology-based. Create a document, which you could call virtual platform specifications or whatever other title you can propose. But what is important for reviewers is to see that you mention which platform it is, whether it is a Zoom webinar, whether it is in-person training, or some learning management system that you deploy to provide self-paced training. How would you know that learners actually performed practical activities? In other words, you need to show that that platform you're using is tracking completion of certain steps. And if it is a Zoom, you will have such an opportunity to check via polls or via people putting some answers in the chat, and that allows you as the trainer to monitor the fact that the learners are actually doing some practical activities that you designed. And then it's important to know how you're tracking completion or attendance of your course overall on that virtual platform. As you all know, Zoom tracks it by, signing in with the email. However, it also allows you signing in with the phone number. How would you identify that that phone number belonged to a specific person, right? So those are the instances that we, the accrediting reviewers, need to know so we can assess whether as a trainer you are capable to assure us that the performance practice actually took place. And with that, we conclude our webinar. Hopefully you found it informative and helpful, and we welcome any questions and suggestions. Contact us at info@cchicertification.org, and we'll be happy to respond to any comments and suggestions.